podcast Green Edge, Best in BESS, Episode 14, LTSA, Contracts Without Obligations. Hello and welcome to Episode 14 of the Green Edge, Best in BESS. In the last episode we talked about the owner's engineer and about the fact that in a service contract, the most ground is won before anyone signs the purchase agreement at all. So today we're going deeper into exactly that, because we have a fresh, very concrete example to work with. Recently, we went through a complete set of LTSA documentation from several large globally recognized BESS container suppliers. Not one page, not a summary, the whole package. The main agreement, the annex covering the capacity performance guarantee, together with the so-called RTE buy-down, meaning the efficiency repurchase mechanism, and a separate annex describing the test methodology. Lots of documents, dozens of pages, a great deal of very professional sounding terminology. And you know what we found in them? Not a single number, literally none. The capacity guarantee, there's a clause, there's a formula, there's an entire legal structure built around that clause, plenty of intelligent sounding content, but no specifics whatsoever. The RTE threshold below which the supplier bears liability, not there. The penalty rate for missing those thresholds, not there. The overall liability cap, well, here's it's either absent or defined in a way that in practice means nothing. Reading it for the first time, you could get the impression you're holding a complete, carefully drafted legal document. What you actually have is a very well-written summary of what the salesperson said in the meeting. Nothing in that could actually secure correct operation after commissioning or compensation if something goes wrong. And I have to be honest with you. The more of these documents I go through, the harder it is to shake the impression that this isn't an accident, it's a method. That someone on the other side of the table is quite deliberately trying to take someone for a ride. And that's disappointing because the industry, at least the part represented by a large, globally recognized suppliers, shouldn't allow itself something like this. It should have the ambition to be more than just selling containers full of batteries. It should genuinely influence what the national power system looks like, how stable the grid is, how well we use renewable energy instead of curtailing it. And looking at how these documents are constructed, with all due respect, I'm starting to doubt it. Because a document built to formally look like a commitment while guaranteeing nothing in practice isn't written by someone thinking about 15 years of shared responsibility for the system. It's written by someone thinking about the signature and about having as much room for interpretation on their side as possible if a dispute ever arises. And I want to add one observation that's come up throughout this podcast for a while now. And the more of these documents I see, the more it holds up. The most vulnerable in all this are small investors, the C&I segment, because they are the ones who actually stand to gain the most from this kind of installations. Load stabilization, peak reduction, their own energy security, and at the same time, they have the least bargaining power to negotiate anything out of a document like this. A large developer, a large fund, has a legal department, has us or someone similar on their side, has the time and budget to say to the supplier, we won't sign this until these fields are filled in. A small industrial investor putting up one or two containers next to their plant often has neither and is at the mercy of both the supplier and the contractor. Actually, I had the chance to see this up close myself recently, but that's a topic for its own episode, and we'll come back to it. Today we're focusing on the mechanism itself, what we see in LTSA documentation regardless of investor scale. I'll show you what such a document looks like from the inside and exactly where the numbers disappear because it's always the same spots. And I'll show you exactly how those clauses are worded because the wording matters enormously here. Then we'll talk about something I think is even more important than the clauses themselves. Who's actually supposed to guarantee this for you in 5 or 10 years? And why supplier bankability needs to be checked with the same rigor as round-trip efficiency. And at the end we'll go to something practical. The order in which all of this should be negotiated, because most investors make a mistake here that costs them a huge amount of time and all their leverage. So let's get started. Let's start with how an LTSA package is put together in the first place, because that alone is instructive. We're not talking about single agreement running a few pages. We're usually talking about several linked documents meant to form one coherent whole. The first is the main agreement itself, the base LTSA. It describes the general scope of service, the inspection schedule, the parties' obligations, fault reporting procedures. It reads well, sounds solid, and it's full of language typical of service agreements. The supplier shall exercise due diligence in accordance with best industry practice. The supplier guarantees, and I want to pause here for a moment because the word guarantees is the key to this whole episode. In these documents, it appears dozens of times. The supplier guarantees system availability. The supplier guarantees achievement of the RTE parameter. The supplier guarantees spare parts availability. Sounds strong, right? Except the word guarantees without a number attached isn't a guarantee. I'm not even sure it's a statement of intent or any real willingness to support the investor. It's really just nicely dressed up language that lets the supplier step away from any responsibility once something actually happens. The next document is the annex covering the performance guarantee, sometimes called the capacity performance guarantee or warranty terms or something similar. Sometimes there's a separate mechanism, they're called RTE buydown. And the name of that mechanism alone is interesting. RTE buydown suggests there's some efficiency threshold below which the supplier buys back the difference, paying the investor the compensation. That sounds like something that should provide real financial protection. And it would, if that threshold were written anywhere as a number at a specific measurement point for a specific year of operation. The next document is usually some kind of methodology annex, describing exactly how the tests are supposed to be carried out, and here we run into something that's genuinely rare on the market. Few suppliers even describe the annual performance test procedure in a way that looks thought through. But even where the procedure is described, it very often ends with a phrase like, the test shall be conducted in accordance with the relevant IEC standard or a procedure approved by the manufacturer. And now, which document is that relevant IEC standard? Who chooses it? The investor or the supplier? And if the investor proposes a specific standard, is the supplier obliged to accept it? Or can they reject it and propose their own manufacturer-approved procedure instead? Meaning, in practice, whatever they write themselves? This clause looks precise because it contains the word standard and the initials IEC, which sounds concrete. In practice, it's another open field, just dressed up in technical jargon that gives the impression something has been settled. This is exactly the mechanism I want you to take away from this part. A supplier who wants to leave themselves an escape hatch doesn't need to lie in any of these three documents individually. The main agreement can be written honestly, language-wise. The test methodology can reference real recognized standards, and yet the whole package gives you no real protection, because at the critical points there isn't even structural space for a number. The sentence is built so the commitment stays general by design, not because someone accidentally left a field blank. That's a distinction I want you to really understand, because this isn't a situation of, oh, we forgot to fill in the value, we'll add it later. It's a sentence constructed so it never has to be filled in, and it's simply waiting for the investor's inattention. And that brings me to a principle that will run through this whole episode. Setting the numbers has to come before legal reading, not the other way around, because you can have perfectly negotiated legal language wrapped around a sentence that by definition has nowhere to hold a specific value, and it still secures nothing. Let me show you exactly what that looks like, clause by clause. Let's move to specifics now, because this is the heart of the episode. I'm not going to show you one document, I'm going to show you a pattern, specific types of clause that repeat from supplier to supplier, regardless of whether we're talking about a large global player or a small integrator. These are literally the same sentence structures, just rewritten in different words. Let's start with service response time. The standard clause reads roughly, the supplier undertakes to carry out repairs at the earliest possible time. And now, the earliest possible in what exactly? 24 hours? 72? 2 weeks? Earliest possible time is a formula that, in practice, means whatever the supplier decides is possible at that particular moment, given their workload, technician availability, and the season. Is that a time-bound commitment? Absolutely not. Second example, and here we come back to RTE. The supplier guarantees achievement of the RTE parameter. Full stop, end of sentence. Which RTE? What percentage? Measured where? At the cell level, across the battery plus PCS system, or at the grid connection point? In which year of operation, since RTE degrades along with capacity, so a guarantee without a stated year is meaningless. Is this first year RTE or average across the whole 15-year period? The word guarantees on its own carries a false sense of security, but without those three elements, the value, the measurement point, and the year, that sentence can't be enforced in any dispute. Sometimes there's a clause saying it's measured on the AC side, but where exactly on the AC side? There are several places you could take that reading from, and on top of that, what is it measured with? A SCADA? The third example is maybe the most striking because it shows the mechanism of referencing a document that looks formal but isn't. I've seen a clause worded like that. State of capacity per Annex 4. Sounds specific, right? There's a reference to a concrete annex. It seems properly addressed. You open Annex 4 and there's a slide. Literally a slide from a sales presentation pasted in as an annex, showing a degradation curve calculated for one charge cycle per day. The mildest, least realistic operating scenario possible, since very few BESS projects in Poland will run at one cycle a day. Most financial models assume much more intensive operation, and in small print in the corner of that same slide the note non-binding. So we have a document that's formally part of the contract, since it's referenced as Annex 4, but which declares in its own text that it isn't binding. This is the question I always ask in a situation like this. Then what's the point of referencing it in the contract at all if it invalidates itself with one sentence in the corner of the page? And here's the best part. At the sales meeting, that same salesperson who presented this slide, when asked why it says non-binding, answered that it's only there for now and will obviously be removed later. And then that same salesperson hands you a contract with the exact annex still in it. Coincidence? Well, I think not. The fourth example concerns spare parts, and it's the kind of clause that looks like real protection at first glance, until you read to the end of the paragraph. The supplier guarantees that spare parts will be available throughout the warranty period. Great, you think. That's exactly what you need. Certainty that in 8 years, when a module needs replacing, the supplier will actually have something to replace it with. And a little further down, in a different paragraph, this sentence appears. The supplier reserves the right to use spare parts of different model than originally installed, or refurbished parts, provided they meet the same specifications. And now, is this a guarantee of access to the same parts, or a guarantee that something will get connected, not necessarily what you paid for? Meets the same specifications according to whose assessment? Who verifies that at the moment of replacement, given that it's the supplier who unilaterally decides a given substitute meets the original specification? Another example, and I consider this one the most deceptive, availability, meaning system availability. The supplier guarantees system availability for a defined portion of the year, and now you search the entire document through every annex for the actual percentage value, 98%, 99%, anything, and you don't find a single line confirming it with a number. And in the case where you do find a document with that percentage actually written in, right after it comes a list of exclusions that in practice removes most of the real infrastructure from the guarantee. Availability doesn't cover the MV transformer, doesn't cover the MV switchgear, doesn't cover the time needed to replace battery modules, and so on. And now the question is, what's actually covered by this availability guarantee? Just the containers themselves, in isolation from the rest of the installation, the energy has to pass through to actually reach the grid? Because if availability is calculated only for the supplier's own components, excluding everything else needed for the system to actually function as a whole, then that number, even if it formally exists, tells you nothing about how much energy you'll actually sell in a given year. And now, notice one thing all 5 examples have in common. In none of them did the supplier write anything you could straightforwardly call a lie. Each sentence, read in isolation, sounds professional and often even specific, because it contains the word guarantee, it refers to an annex, it cites an IEC standard by name. The problem only shows up when you ask one simple question after each sentence. Specifically, how much, measured where, in which year, verified by whom? And in a vast majority of cases, there's simply no answer to that question in the document because the sentence was never built to contain one. And think about this from the perspective of what happens after signing. The system operates, a year goes by, 2 years, 3 years. Availability drops, maybe due to a transformer fault, maybe due to delays, replacing modules, and so on. You pull out the LTSA to check what availability level you were guaranteed and whether the specific fault is even covered. And it turns out the MV transformer was excluded from scope from the very beginning. Something nobody mentioned out loud during negotiation because it was one line on a list of exclusions on page 20 of the annex. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly where signing a document built from sentences like these leads. Except you only see the consequences years later, once changing everything has become very difficult and very expensive. And now let me show you the real standout example. This one's a bit different from the previous ones, because it's not about a sentence with no room for a number. It's about how a supplier responds when someone actually tries to pin one of these clauses down. In one of the contracts we went through, there was a clause stating that the warranty is voided in the case of damage caused by an AC side overvoltage. That alone raises a question because the supplier installs its own protective equipment specifically to prevent that kind of overvoltage in the first place. So the buyer flagged that if the damage was caused by a defect in the protective equipment, the warranty exclusion shouldn't apply. Logically, you're buying a system made up of several components connected to each other, tested together at FAT, at the supplier's facility, designed by the supplier who also selected the appropriate protective equipment. So I'm sorry, but what? Who's responsible for that then? And now a very interesting response from the supplier, encouraging, at least at first glance. Of course, they wrote, we agree. Damage caused directly by a defect in our protective equipment should not be subject to exclusion. Sounds like a concession, right? Except right below the sentence came a redrafted version of the clause, and this is exactly the moment you need to read very carefully. Because the new version shifted the entire burden of verifying the fault, of proving that it was the protective equipment's fault, onto the buyer. The investor now has to demonstrate with clear objective technical evidence, fault records, waveform data, event logs, that the damage was caused directly and exclusively by a defect in the supplier's equipment. And in the absence of such evidence, the warranty exclusion automatically applies again in the supplier's favor. On top of that came additional exclusions, additional descriptions of what happens in this scenario or that one, and a cap limiting the supplier's liability solely to the value of the defective component, which doesn't make much sense to begin with, but at that point it's hard to justify it in any way. It's simply an open retreat from responsibility. So formally the supplier agreed. They wrote, we agree with your position. And in practice, in that same document, they build the clause so that enforcing that agreement requires real costs from you. Real evidence that's very hard to gather under actual operating conditions. And even once you gather it, the compensation is capped at an amount that won't even cover the real loss. This is probably the best example for today of the fact that a supplier's verbal agreement during negotiations means nothing until you check how that agreement got translated into an actual clause. Good. So we've now covered RTE, we've covered SOH, we know how they should be measured and who should verify them. But now I want to ask a question I think matters more than every clause in the contract combined. Who's actually going to guarantee this for you in 5 years or maybe in 10? Because I see two opposite approaches to LTSA pricing in the market, and both are warning signs, just for completely different reasons. The first approach, LTSA effectively bundled into the system purchase price. The supplier says 10 years of service, free, included in the container price. Sounds great on the offer sheet, except it's mathematically unrealistic. 10 years of regular inspections, spare parts availability, technicians ready to travel, capacity test, a team that picks up the phone at 3 in the morning when the system trips. That's a real operating cost, spread across a decade. If that cost isn't visible anywhere in the price, it means one of two things. Either the supplier is counting on the fact that someone of you will simply never enforce that service, or, worse, they don't yet know themselves how much it's going to cost, because they don't have enough operating history of their own projects to calculate it. Or, and this needs to be said outright, there's another possibility. It may turn out, and fairly soon at that more than one player in the BESS market who advertises themselves as the best at everything simply won't exist in 2 or 3 years. And believe me, that won't be an accident. Because service and maintenance isn't just some OPEX line item you plug into the model because someone told you to include it. It's a real cost and not a small one. If that cost doesn't show up anywhere in the price, it's very possible it simply hasn't been calculated yet, and the supplier growing fastest and shouting loudest about their scale today might be exactly the one who finds out very soon how much that missing calculation really costs. The second approach, sky-high pricing. LTSA priced so high it effectively discourages the buyer from purchasing the service at all. And here I'll come back to what I said in episode 13. Service represents real substantial costs, and the supplier who wants to sell hardware rather than a service will do everything possible to avoid formally delivering that service. An inflated LTSA price is one of the simplest ways to technically have it on an offer while counting on the investor to walk away from it themselves, after which responsibility for the entire system lifecycle falls on an independent O&M provider who then has to chase the manufacturer for spare parts and service documentation anyway. And now we get to the core of this part. Even if you have a perfectly written LTSA with a clear RT measurement methodology, an independent SOH test, precisely defined warranty conditions, all of it is only worth as much as the entity on the other side of the signature is worth in 5 or 10 years. Choosing an energy storage supplier isn't a one-off equipment purchase. It's entering a 10 to 15 year operational partnership, and the supplier's creditworthiness and financial credibility feed directly into the cost of financing the entire project. The current boom in this market has attracted a lot of lower tier integrators who mask serious risks sitting just under the surface of their offer. And the single biggest commercial risk in this industry is what some analysts literally call system orphaning. If you choose a supplier purely on the lowest capex and they declare bankruptcy in year 3 of operation, your multi-million euro project is effectively paralyzed. And this isn't a theoretical scenario. Over the past year, 3 serious, well-financed Scandinavian companies have gone down one after another in the European cell manufacturing market. Morrow filed for bankruptcy, the third major Nordic battery producer to do so, after Nordvolt and Frey Battery, which cancelled its gigafactory projects and pivoted toward the US solar market. Morrow has signed supply contracts, had started serial production earlier that year, even had a defense sector customer, and still cut costs before the line even ramped up, and a few days after announcing new commercial wins, filed for bankruptcy. In the US, meanwhile, Powin, one of the significant BESS system integrators, collapsed last year, 8 months after receiving a $200 million loan from KKR. FlexGen took over its intellectual property and part of its fleet over the course of 184 days of liquidation. These were companies with financing, with contracts, with a market reputation, and they still didn't make it to the point where their guarantees would have actually had to hold up. So if you're negotiating an LTSA, part of your job, before you even get to redlining the legal language, is checking the supplier's financial health, and not based on a marketing brochure or a salesperson's announcements, but on a hard indicators. It's worth knowing the tool analysts use here. The Altman Z-score, a standard financial model estimating the probability of company bankruptcy over the next 2 years based on liquidity, profitability, and leverage. Sinovoltaics regularly publishes a ranking of more than 60 best manufacturers worldwide based on exactly this metric, sorting them into a safe zone, a gray zone of moderate risk, and a bankruptcy risk zone. And interestingly, in the latest edition of that ranking, the gray zone, meaning moderate financial risk, includes brands that look absolutely safe at the first glance. And the risk zone includes several publicly listed manufacturers, including some storage business owned by large, well-known solar groups. I'm not saying this to trigger panic over every offer you get. I'm saying it because it's exactly the same mechanism as with RTE or SOH. If you don't measure something with a defined methodology, you're left with a salesperson assurance, not a hard fact. Supplier bankability can be measured just as precisely as charge cycle efficiency. Very few people ask about it at the LTSA negotiation stage. Everyone asks about it once the supplier stops answering the phone. And now let's come back to the clauses themselves. The ones I showed you in the previous part, because that's exactly where suppliers most like to leave themselves an escape hatch. With RTE, the question of at what level you're measuring efficiency, at the cell level, across the battery plus PCS system, or at the connection point. Those differences can span several, sometimes over a dozen percentage points, and the offer almost always shows you the most favorable number, measured under laboratory conditions without accounting for auxiliary consumption for container cooling or heating. A supplier who doesn't want to take on responsibility will leave RTE undefined. No measurement point, no temperature conditions, no operating profile. And then, in a dispute, they'll always find an interpretation that defends their result. With capacity, exactly the same mechanism, just with a different variable, the SOH measurement methodology. If the manufacturer's BMS is the only data source, then in a warranty dispute you're relying on data from the party you're disputing with. The supplier knows perfectly well that an independent capacity test is the only evidence that carries weight in a dispute like that. And that's exactly why a number of the contracts we've seen don't specify at all who has the right to commission such a test, using what methodology, or who covers the cost. That missing clause isn't an oversight. It's deliberately left open gap. So wrapping up this part, before you sit down to redline the RTE and SOH clause, answer two questions for yourself. First, based on their financial health, will this supplier even still exist by the time you need to enforce this guarantee? And second, do the clauses in front of you actually give you a tool to enforce anything, or just a nice looking number with no methodology behind it? Because an LTSA that doesn't answer both questions isn't protection. It's a wish written down on a paper. And that brings me to something practical, because diagnosing the problem won't get you very far if you don't know what to do about it. I see a very specific mistake repeating in how investors approach LTSA negotiations, and it's a mistake of sequence. The standard path looks like this. The investor receives a draft LTSA, hands it to a lawyer, the lawyer does the redlining, tightens definitions, refines escalation procedures, adds jurisdiction clauses, improves the force majeure language, solid professional legal work. Except the same lawyer, however good they are, will very rarely ask why the capacity guarantee sentence has no room for a number in it. Because that's not a legal question, it's an engineering question and needs to be resolved before legal redlining even makes sense. And what is SOC, SOH, RTE, a cycle, BMS, EMS, AC side or DC side? That's simply not their domain. Lawyers don't need to know that. And that's completely normal. Imagine sending your lawyer a document with the same spare parts clause I mentioned earlier. The supplier guarantees availability but reserves the right to use substitute. The lawyer can refine the language around that clause, spell out the notification procedure, response deadlines, the form of notice about a substitute. All of that work has real legal value. But if the underlying construction of the sentence, a guarantee immediately undercut by an exception in the same paragraph, stays untouched, then all of that legal stuff is being applied around a clause that still doesn't protect you. It's exactly the same trap I mentioned regarding technical specifications in the last episode. You can perfectly refine the procedure around something that never had a firm commitment to begin with. So the order we recommend is the reverse of what most investors follow. First, we sit down with the investor's technical team and together we work out which number actually makes sense for the specific project. What degradation curve is realistic for the given cell chemistry and operating profile, not at one cycle a day from a sales deck, but under a real profile. What RTE threshold is achievable and at what measurement level it should be defined. What penalty rate actually disciplines the supplier instead of being cosmetic. And what liability cap matches the real financial risk scale of the whole project, not just the value of the service contract itself. That's the work we do before the document even reaches a lawyer. Only once those numbers are set and accepted by both sides do we move to locking them into solid, enforceable legal language. Language that leaves no room for a phrase like earliest possible time or in accordance with the relevant standard. And there's one more reason this sequence matters, because the logic itself, it's the exact same negotiating leverage dynamic I talked about it in the owner's engineering episode. Until you sign the agreement, the supplier wants that contract and is willing to talk specific numbers. A real RTE threshold, a real degradation curve, a penalty rate that actually means something. The moment you sign the supply agreement and leave the LTSA to sort out later, with these general sentences, that leverage disappears. Because now the supplier already has your order, and refining those clauses has become a pure cost to them, one they want to minimize. That's why the numbers in the LTSA need to be negotiated in parallel with the main supply contract, not afterwards. And within the LTSA itself, the numbers need to be set, literally not left for the so-called later. Later meaning when exactly. So to sum up today's episode, the LTSA is a very important agreement for an investor. Is it necessary? Well, that's an entirely different question because, as usual, it depends on a lot of factors. Can a project be maintained without an LTSA? Of course. Would that be safer for the investor? Well, it depends what you're comparing it to. Could another arrangement end up cheaper than an LTSA with the supplier? Again, it depends. But one thing is certain. Contracts without numbers aren't the exceptions, they are the pattern, and it repeats across the documentation regularly, regardless of how large or reputable the supplier is. Response time defined as earliest possible time. RTE guaranteed with no stated measurement point or year. Capacity referred to an annex that turns out to be a sales slide marked non-binding. A spare parts guarantee undercut a sentence later by the right to use substitutes. System availability, no percentage written in, and where the percentage is written in, a list of exclusions that removes most of the real infrastructure from the guarantee. None of these clauses looks dramatic on its own, but together they form a document that gives you a sense of security without any real protection, and that's a serious problem. On top of that, there's a layer most investors don't even think about at the signing stage, that even a perfectly written LTSA is only worth as much as the entity on the other side of it in 5 or 10 years. Supplier longevity is another important factor that needs checking with the same rigor as the system's technical parameters, because the best manufacturing market, for all its growth, keeps showing us companies with solid financing and solid contracts that still didn't make it to the point where their guarantees would have had to hold up. And that's why the rule I want you to take away from this episode is specifics and numbers first. Before you sit down with a lawyer, before anything else, make sure there's actually something concrete to establish. And someone might say, well, we've covered this before, we generally get the idea. To that I'd say, I read 2 or 3 complete contracts a week, on average, on different subjects of different character, from different suppliers and contractors, for different investors. And I can tell you one thing, somewhere past the 50th page, you genuinely start to wonder whether it's you who's got something wrong or whether the contract itself is worthless. And now, as usual, a couple of words about what we do. If you're at the stage of negotiating a contract, or you're about to receive one and want to know what to look for before that happens, GreenEdge Solutions helps exactly at this stage. We go through LTSA documentation line by line, check which sentences actually guarantee something and which are just nicely worded declarations without a number attached, and help establish real enforceable threshold values before the lawyer starts polishing the language around them. We also verify the suppliers so you know exactly who you're entering a 15-year operational partnership with, before you sign, not after. ROVA Systems operates on a completely different level than just verifying what the supplier does under the LTSA, because for many projects, we are a genuine alternative to the LTSA itself. We can take on full responsibility for the site, carry out everything required to maintain the manufacturer's warranty, and do it with full awareness of exactly where the supplier has left themselves escape hatches, the kind I talked about today, because we know these clauses from the inside. We also help map out the specific scope of responsibilities, both on the supplier side under the LTSA and on the O&M side, so nothing falls into the gap between the two agreements, and we flag in advance the specific gaps that will become a real problem, say in year 4 of operation, when the first serious fault puts all those unresolved points to the test. If you're looking for support structuring the scope for long-term operation, or you need a partner who can genuinely guarantee the financing bank that the system will perform for a defined period, ROVA Systems is that partner. And if this episode showed you even one sentence worth paying attention to before you sign an agreement, you won't be able to enforce anything from, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and pass it along to whoever on your team handles BESS. Thank you very much for today. See you next week. Cześć!